Very good. I'm very, very happy to be introducing Professor Aïcha Liviana Messina, who comes to us from Chile. I've only spent a bit of time with Aïcha, so I'm very, very happy to be rejoining her in this occasion. She sponsored a marvelous conference on Blanchot some years ago that I was able to participate in, and that helps me lead into her work. She's done very important work on Blanchot and Levinas, among others, quite a few others. And I don't often read through titles, but let me do these just so that I can have the pleasure of trying to remember how Spanish sounds. In other words, in the back of my mind as I'm missing it. So she has published a number of books, a lot of articles, and also edited volumes, but let me mention the books. Una falla en la lógica del universo, Cartas desde la cornisa. Then there's Feminismo y Revolución, Crónica de una inquietud, excuse me. Then in French, L'anarchie de la paix, Levinas et la philosophie politique. Then Argent, Amour, le livre blanc de manuscrit de 1844. And then a work of fiction, Posez me va si bien. And she, as I said, she's edited several volumes, but she also worked with Sara Pozzoli, who brought that last piece of fiction, Posez me va si bien, brought that to film. So she has a really very, very extensive range of interests and achievements. And I'm looking very much forward to what she'll do today, which will touch on our moment in a way that I think we did quite a bit last year. And the moment evolves, but it remains very fraught. And so I'm very grateful that she addresses it in the way she does today. Let me just very quickly thank Nemanja Mitrovic for his work in this series of public lectures. And let me also mention that our first deadline for registration in our MA and PhD programs is May 24th. Please visit our website if you want to see precisely what is being offered in the seminars. They look really quite exciting this year. And I just mentioned that they will be taking place on weekends. So it should be easier than ever to join us. So with that, let me pass the screen to Aïcha and welcome her warmly to the EGS for the first time. And one of many, I hope. Thank you, Aïcha.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank very much Professor Finks for this invitation, for his trust, and for the possibility of meeting in this inside and outside that Zoom imposes on us. It's really an honor, and needless to say that it's very intimidating for me. I also want to thank very much Nemanja Mitrovic for making this conference possible, for his kindness and for his patience. It's really a pleasure to meet you. So at first, I had planned to give a talk on the relationship between violence and silence, and to focus on Blanchot thought. But for very contingent reasons that are common to all of us, I decided to change the topic. However, as you will see, I will make some hints to this relationship between violence and silence. So maybe in the discussion, we can take it again and deeper it. So what happened is that at the beginning of April, a new lockdown began in Santiago, which made it very difficult for me and for many other people. And I thought that the international context of this seminar could be the occasion to think what is happening to all of us. The pandemic demands a great deal of us. It relates us to ourselves and to others in countless ways. Some people are dramatically alone. Some are dramatically together. And being dramatically together always entails being dramatically alone, and vice versa. The lockdown might have allowed to touch limits, at least for some people in some situation, while it has no limits in time. Not necessarily because we don't know when it will finish, but because it entails another relation to time. Coming back to Blanchot, but I had decided to drop out of his conference, and I promised that I dropped him, but he's out of his conference. The lockdown is paradoxically our outside. We are constantly exposed, au dehors. Although we are supposed to be protected at home, our interior has become our exterior. This is the case with Zoom. The exterior always penetrates the interior, and we are never quiet. The days never end. There is no more limits between the private, the public, the professional, the domestic, being a professor, being a mother. For this reason, I thought we could reflect on something that after all is common to all of us. Indeed, the pandemic crosses boundaries. It is a sort of common loneliness, of common vulnerability. Although each country adopts different measures, we are all facing changes, very important changes, in our modes of living and thinking that affect all of us. Something common of a globalization, mondialization, emerges, but is not merely the market, although of course the market is now decisive in facing the situation and in the distribution of a vaccine. Of course, I have not sorted everything out about the pandemic. I have not sorted anything out, actually. However, it's a good moment to seek not so much a theory of a pandemic as if it were an object of study, but rather the instruments that would allow thinking our reality, the reality in which we found ourselves. So the question that I will address in this conference are, is there a pandemic, or are we in a pandemic, or are we the pandemic? Is the pandemic something that occurred to us from the outside as an object happens to a subject and that we can only try to overcome? Or has the pandemic already constituted political subjects, political worlds, and worlds of life, cultural frameworks, subjectivities, sensibilities, and specific bodies? So to sum it up, is there a pandemic? Is the virus a mere object that will be overcome by the vaccine, namely by science? Or are we in a pandemic? Has the virus already defined a new world, new conditions for life, for interaction, for thinking? Or, third question, are we subjects, the pandemic? Can subjects be considered independently from viruses, from anything that circulates, and above all, from our common vulnerability? So has the pandemic only changed our world, or has it also changed us as subjects that we believe to be? On this matter, I was surprised last year, in March 2020, to see in discussions published in newspapers that columnists were talking about the pandemic like an anthropologist would speak about a civilization that he or she observes. This is to say, as if in the pandemic, we were in front of objects that can be observed, while our mode of observing, thinking, and criticizing were not altered by the pandemic, by the porosity that this pandemic has revealed, by the social and political configurations to which it has given place. Are we the same as before? Are we the same subjects of thinking? Or is thinking the pandemic to look for instruments that allow us to make a critical gesture towards our categories of thought? The pandemic, namely the lockdown, the fast development of telecommuting, the modification of the relationships between the private and the public that this involves, the use of technology, the health measures, etc., as all of this affected our ways of thinking, of being subjects, of conceiving objects? Well, this is philosophy, isn't it? A critical exercise, above all, of our way of thinking, a critical exercise on what is possible to know, to put it in a Kantian way. Philosophy does not give us certainties. It puts us, subjects, before the abyss that we are. So thinking the pandemic is necessarily thinking ourselves in the pandemic. If we think about it, the critical exercise towards the theories of the pandemic emerged very quickly last year. In March or April, there was already, in March or April of 2020, there was already a philosophical debate in which we could take stance. There were opposing positions. There are always opposing positions, at least in appearance. On the one hand, Zizek, who would have seen in the pandemic a way toward overcoming capitalism, and on the other, Byung-Chul Han, who would have seen in the pandemic a strengthening of neoliberalism and of the authoritarianism it involves. Sorry for the English. I will not linger on this debate, in which in fact, I don't think there are two very opposing worldviews. For Zizek, overcoming capitalism does not necessarily imply its end, but rather what he calls a disaster communism, in which, due to the state of emergency, the states have no choice but to respond to a common need. For Han, the growing fatigue brought on by the pandemic also reveals other modes of living. So Zizek and Han certainly have different views, but they also have common feelings. And this might be more interesting than the opposed frames in which we tend to install thinkers and which maintain the debate intact. In fact, I think the hasty way in which we have seen an opposition drawn between Zizek and Han may be the symptom of impatience before a situation of uncertainty and of this time in which words and thoughts must be given time to emerge. We don't necessarily have the words for something that is new. For this reason, I would like to take the debate to a different level, one that revolves more around common sense, one for which we don't have many words, although it is not exempt of readings, theories, ideas, all this which of course constitutes us. Regarding the language of thought, and in particular on the question of how to think novelty, how to think events for which we might not have categories, I have been stricken by the haste with which Giorgio Agamben wrote during the first days of a lockdown last year in Italy. Last year, when the pandemic had driven Italy, which was the first European country, I think, that went into the lockdown. So last year, when the pandemic had driven Italy into total lockdown, and given the way in which people were dying, namely like in wartime situations where people die with no human world and sometimes without funeral or rituals, well, in this moment, Agamben compared the coronavirus to a flu that states took advantage of in order to normalize the state of exception and take absolute control over individuals. Later, in reflections published in columns and then included in a book, A che punto siamo, published in 2020, he also speaks about the collusion that could exist between medical power, science, and the states. A collusion that in other moments in history have made extermination politics possible. Where Agamben compares science with a religion, with religion, who takes over individuals with the goal of saving them. And he recalls the ideological use of science during the 30s in Germany, when science was used at the service of eugenic political agenda, eugenism. I found that Agamben's theses are typical of a thought that is followed by quick analogies, without asking what would make possible comparing one situation to another, one world to another. It's a politics of extermination in which a nation seeks to affirm its strength with theoretical support, the same as a world that reveals itself on a global scale in its vulnerability, and in which the priority is to protect others, the most vulnerable. The problem is that in order to think a new situation, Agamben uses words that belong to a world that perhaps no longer exists. However, to think a world that is mutating like ours might require new words or a new relation to language, and even a new relation to ourselves as subject of thinking. Generally, for Agamben, the coronavirus does not represent a political problem, not the virus itself. It is a virus like any other flu. Rather, for Agamben, the political problem is located in the state's designation of it as an enemy that should be combated. Hence, the political problem is the result of a collision between epidemiologists and governments who act in order to have total control over the individuals who surrender their political rights to merely conservative ends, conserve their lives. So for Agamben, the political problem is not in the virus itself, but in the way the states are approaching the virus, are naming the virus, and are using the virus to suspend our rights. Depoliticized, these individuals are reduced to a state of bare life, vida nuda. Before this already absurd position of a theory, I have been drawn to Nancy's very simple words and response to the comparison between the coronavirus and the flu made by Agamben. Nancy, who we know has a particularly weak immune system and who has also written from his own vulnerability, I'm thinking of L'Intrus when Nancy had been operated, responded to him that we have a vaccine for the flu. So last year we didn't have a vaccine for the coronavirus. So following this observation, if the flu does not constitute a political problem, it is because we already have ways to immunize ourselves from a massive contagion. Beyond this disagreement, that has above all interested me because there is a relation to vulnerability entailed in Nancy's response. I was struck that the discussion took a turn around the topic of the flu. Indeed, what is a flu? What is a disease in general? Is a flu merely contingent and natural, or are all diseases political? Agamben's allegations remind me that at the beginning of the pandemic, it was said that the coronavirus was a flu like any other. The example that people, not necessarily Agamben, took to illustrate that point is that the elderly, the old people, were the ones who were dying. It was hence natural, not political. If it's the older one who are dying, well, it's normal. This flu is like any other. So it was natural or normal, but not political. But is death natural or political? Is the vulnerability of the elderly, of the old people, just a normal fact, or does it have a political stake? It seems to me that by relegating death and the vulnerability of the death of the elderly to the realm of what is natural or normal, this excludes old age and vulnerability from the political realm. Now, we could address the issue. Isn't there something political about being old, about being finite, about being vulnerable? Is it normal to die? It's common, but maybe it's not so normal. In some, Agamben's position, which quickly became part of the common sense, was based on the idea that something that according to him was not political, the flu, the elderly's vulnerability, I hope my English is fine, was being politicized with the effect of depoliticizing society. This, in fact, is the very structure of a state of exception, according to Agamben, and I would agree with him on this point. The state has absolute power and citizens no longer belong to a polis. Their rights are suspended. They can no longer act politically. Another position that I perceive this time in the ways in which the pandemic is being covered by the media is located in what I would call, maybe very improperly, because this is something that I'm just recently starting to think, the sacrificial or somehow naturalistic positions. More broadly, these positions stipulate that what is happening to us is a misfortune, a rebellion of nature before humanity's arrogance, and that in the face of such an unquestionable reality as nature would be, one must be humble, sacrificed, hardworking when one has a job, of course, focused on what is called essential goods. This is something that we talk about a lot in Chile, bienes esenciales. Family, nourishment, the economy. In some, while for Agamben, the flu is nothing, for others, the coronavirus is everything, it transcends. While for Agamben, the coronavirus is nothing because it is natural, for others, it is everything because it is natural. It is the nature that confronts the civilized human being who is used to thinking that he controls everything. This is what circulates in multiple ways, and that even people who have very different political opinion may come to think. I remember that some people were, including very good friends, were obfuscated at the beginning of the lockdown last year by the feminist grievances, which drew attention to interfamilial violence and the domestic labor, which would become incompatible with telecommuting. Some people would say that it was repugnant to do politics in a time in which we were living a natural catastrophe that affected everyone. So here, nature's language silences the language of right, to come back to my topic, violence and silence. When something transcendent or natural is acting, human being, namely political being, have nothing to say. This is the logic that was entailed in these opinions. When something transcendent is acting, human beings are depoliticized. I remember also a columnist that criticized the attempts of various philosophers for thinking about what was going on. An important columnist in Chile, an important intellectual. He opposed the chatter of the authors of a book, Super Wuhan. I don't know if you had such a book published in English. It's a book that was published very early last year when the pandemic started, and that gathered different articles on the pandemia from Judith Butler, Zizek, Han, Nancy, Agamben, etc. So this intellectual opposed the chatter of the authors of a book, Super Wuhan, to the authentic, silent nature of death and pain, implying that in difficult situations, we should give up speaking, thinking, seeking words, as imperfect as they may be. This, in the name of the mysterious nature of pain or death, the mysterious or sacred nature of death, as if there were no death and pain, because we are in a shared experience, because we are political beings, and therefore being that speaks, think, communicate, always improperly. Finally, as part of this naturalist approach of the pandemic, I remember that last year, at least at the beginning of the lockdown, when it was something new, a moment of peace was being celebrated for those who could afford it. A moment of family life in which finally we cooked, baked, homemade bread. We returned to the essential. I suppose that we could also appreciate the silence in the streets, the song of birds, and the brief pollution-free air. Didn't last very much in Santiago. For a while, it was said that the pandemic would free us from civilization and its evils. Free at least from the evil of civilization, we would once again feel the essence of human ties. This idea circulated last year, and we still hear them, no matter how different we are. They affirm the sacredness of life or death against the artificiality of politics. These positions implicitly posit some values as sacred, or let's say essential: life, the permanence of a species, death, family, bread, ecology, the purity of the air, silence. And in doing so, in my view at least, they reduce the importance of struggles, of rights that are not sacred, but that are built and are historical. To fight for rights implies making visible situations of vulnerability, but by definition are invisible. It is to give them a name and then use this name, this artifice that is language. So indeed, I find this position dangerous because in raising unquestionable values, many injustices can be left in silence and many abuses can become acceptable. In this epistemological context, society is constituted around what is called essential goods, to the detriment of our political existence. Now we could ask ourselves if what exists are essential goods or political goods. Here in Chile, permissions to circulate in the city or to open a store during the lockdown are explicitly defined in function of what is called essential goods. In other countries, we speak of priority goods, but here in Chile, we speak of essential goods. For instance, food stores remained open during the lockdown because nutrition is considered an essential good. But is eating merely an essential or natural act, essential in a biological sense, necessary for survival? Or is it not always political? Isn't the issue of food always the question of what we eat, how we eat, with whom we eat? The importance of veganism today, no matter if we are not vegan, is a proof or a signal that eating is a political problem. It speaks about our ways of being in the world with others that are like us, with other living beings, and even with the way in which we relate to life and death. Think about what the host means for Christianity, or more broadly, in how in many religions, eating is related to ethical issues. In fact, they are priority goods, but priority is not the same as essential. At this time, it seems to me more important to eat food than to have a beer. But if we could never have a beer, or go out at night, or get together to chat, maybe eating would be pointless. It wouldn't even be possible. We would not feel hunger any longer. Indeed, last year during the lockdown, I didn't feel hungry. We eat within a world where many other possibilities exist, and this nourishes us. It also feeds our hunger. Hunger needs to be fed by a world, by what Levinas would call spiritual nourishment. Think of the metamorphosis in Kafka, where when the son wakes up as an insect, he feels hungry for music. We are not only hungry for food. It is within a cultural world that our hunger takes a shape. So hunger might be essential, but in the measure in which it is political, it belongs to a world. It is interesting to think that in some countries, bookstores were considered priority goods. This does not have an economical impact because de facto books are being sold online, and it's a better time for book right now. But if we know that a bookstore is open, maybe it changes our hunger in a general way. Our hunger for food, for books, for others, for encounters, for newness. If books are our priority goods, as food is, then we eat in another way because we are not reduced to needs. We eat not only for survival, also to desire, also to live. And maybe surviving and living cannot be so easily distinguished. Thus, determining what will be priority goods and not essential goods has a very powerful political effect, almost magical, because within the realm of needs, it opens possibilities. It enables what we call resilience, namely to be able to breathe in a suffocating context, to be able to see a window inside the enclosure or a world inside of loneliness. So speaking about essential goods means that nature imposes you what will be essential, while speaking about priority goods means that we have to define which will be these goods within a world which is humanly built and not imposed by nature. Maybe you notice that, at least from the perspective that I am trying to present, these two positions, that of a criticism of the authoritarian states and that of its justification through the sacred nature of life, as opposed as they may be, share the same premise. They act as if life was apolitical, as if it were something either natural or sacred, either normal or essential. In the case of a criticism of a state of exception, this criticism is made by insinuating that the flu does not require political measures, but the elderly's problem of vulnerability in the face of a disease is natural and not political. But just as Nancy responded to Agamben, we have a vaccine for the flu. And to this, we must add, there are politics related to the funding, accessibility, and even the free access to the flu vaccine. For the flu, there is a politics, healthcare structures, fundings, company policies. The diseases is always political, not only in the Foucauldian sense, not only in the sense that would draw Foucault, but is in the epistemic frameworks that allow distinguishing between the healthy and the sick, the normal and the pathologic, but also in the Marxist sense that all reality depends on a structure. Where there are no structures that allow caring for another, there is no disease, there is just pain. And in some cases, there are no other people to hear the cry of those who suffer. To care for another, to hear a pain, depends on a structure. As Marx would say, sensibility depends on a world. It is constructed. To be sick is to be with others. It is the possibility of having bonds that create new perceptions, ways of being convalescent. It creates worlds. And for this, we need structures, institution, politics. So disease is political in multiple ways because it depends on institution and because it creates perception, sensibility, links to others. Agamben speaks of a flu as if the disease were not always already political, always already a state, social or institutional problem. He addresses disease from the epistemological point of view of a division between disease and health, but not from the point of view of the question of what it means to suffer, and from the phenomenological problem of its inscription in an horizon of meaning. The same goes for death. It is not a mere natural phenomenon. Everybody dies, it's true, but it is never normal to die. We speak of death with a determined cultural framework, ritualizing death, that is to say, forming a community around disappearance. As Levinas would say, death is always a scandal. It is never normal, even though everybody dies. And of course, if an epidemic forces infected people into isolation, the problem is not the mere factuality of death, but rather how one dies. In this case, alone, without greetings, sometimes without rituals. And this is political. This is a political problem because it questions the very foundations of our societies. In the case of what I call the sacrificial or naturalistic position, this is something that we can discuss, and I will not defend these words. They are more diffuse and therefore it is harder to trace their theoretical foundation. In general, it is thought that we are in a state of emergency and that there will be a return to normal. This is what generally we expect, a return to normality. Thus, it is thought that the coronavirus is an object and that we just need to have it under control to suspend the state of exception and return to normal. This is how the pandemic is understood as an object, but there is a pandemic, but it is something natural that we must master through technique. But is a virus something natural? Is there such a thing as nature? Isn't the virus already technical, creator of worlds and worldviews? The fact that immunity is obtained through inoculation, through the inoculation of the virus, and I've just been vaccinated, by the way, this shows the resolutive dimension of the virus. In fact, the virus is not an object that at some point we could neutralize. It speaks about us as subjects, about our infectivity, about our porosity to each other, and about the way in which through social dynamics, we reach our political conditions for survival. Immunity, contrary to what is sometimes said, is not what shuts us from the other. It is what makes possible a relationship with the other. For this reason, and we reach immunity through the virus. For this reason, I think that the virus is not natural, it is political. It requires a politics, financing policies for science, for vaccines, and it has a political dimension. It always already implies a social organization and a specific focus toward others. Faced with these two positions, both which have some truth, my proposal is to think that we are not in a pandemic, but we are a pandemic. That is, that what is occurring to us currently is not a parenthesis, it is a political configuration that accounts for a mutation of society. This is to say that it demands new keys for reading. In this sense, unlike the Agambenian position that postulates an apolitical dimension of life or of a disease, of a flu, I think that an epidemic is in itself political because it speaks about our porosity toward each other. It disposes roles, it changes the relationship between the visible and the invisible. In other words, it transforms subjectivities. In other words, it does not just shape the world, but it also puts it into a hierarchy. In relation to the sacrificial position that postulates the idea that what we are experiencing is only a parenthesis, but today must be sacrificed for a better tomorrow, I think that today's world is that of tomorrow, and that what is being shaped are radical mutations of our political categories. So today is tomorrow. This, of course, is just an hypothesis. I have not fully framed it yet. So I'll dig now into this hypothesis, taking an example. So my hypothesis is that we are the pandemic, not only insofar as we are porous, infectious, and infected, but to the extent that this porosity implies new political devices in the broad sense of the term. One of these devices are the virtual platforms through which telecommuting takes place, and which we are doing right now. We are right now using this device, which allows telecommuting. Regarding these virtual platforms, and specifically regarding our situation, that of moving the university to virtual classrooms, something interesting happens in language. To speak of virtual classrooms implies precisely a transfer, a metaphor, but also a mimesis and a reproduction. Virtual classrooms are like the so-called real classrooms, but they are also take place of a real classroom. Currently, virtual classrooms are the only real classrooms. So we are in a new reality. The metaphor does not necessarily mean that we can still count on a difference between real and virtual. The virtual seems to have transformed the real. Although it is possible that later we will return to the face-to-face modality or presential modality, at this time, the virtual is our reality, our space, our way of contacting to each other, and maybe there will be no return in the past. Aucun retour en arrière. Now, what happens with virtual classroom? Is everything the same as before? Are we a metaphor of the before? Are we like before, or are we different than the before? Unlike before, classes, I don't know if it's the case everywhere, but it's the case in Chile, classes are recorded. In some institutions, they must be recorded. It's an obligation. In my time, not so long ago, a long time ago, but not so long ago, in my time, it was not legal to record someone else's words without asking their permission. Now you do not have to ask permission because it is an obligation, at least in some universities. This is very useful, especially for students who do caring for their children or parents or who are working. But this is also complicated in relation to academic freedom. freedom, for instance. Moreover, in many cases, technology imposes new methods without the consent and reflection of the academics. So on the one hand, new methodologies are imposed to us, and on the other hand, there is a new system of control. Every word is under control, and not just the word, but also the silences, the ways in which we speak, the body of the one who speaks, their expression, their gestures. For some professors, the recording of their speaking image is violent, not to mention the possibility that this image can be circulated and wrongly used. Now, I think that to teach is an événement. It is always intimate and unique. It depends on a relation to others. To think is to think in public, to think with others. Nowadays, we can substitute short recordings. Here in Chile, we call them cápsulas of a class, but the professor is expected to record alone, without students, without this theater that is a class, without this intimacy that the walls make possible. So what is lost in many cases when we prepare the class at home alone, what is lost is the theater, which is also to say the authorship. And what is interesting with authorship is that thinking is made with others. I am the author of what I think because I am in relation with others. But if I'm recording the class at home, I am just repeating something that anybody could repeat, but that has no relation, no intimacy with others. This is something that perhaps was already happening before, but now very quickly, it has given shape to our word and teaching, to our relation to language also. This reality, at once both metaphorical and real, is thus twofold. It allows new forms of democratization of knowledge, but it also allows new authoritarianism, control measures, forms of violence, even fear and loneliness, because it isn't that easy to speak about these topics when the norm is dictated by contingency and not, for example, by a proposal of law that would result from a collective reflection. So here, these devices are imposed silently, as if they were imposed by nature, by this transcendent dimension of a coronavirus. I'm saying that to relate it again to my topic, violence and science. It's not the same to discuss a proposal of law and to have it imposed by a contingent situation that is perceived as transcendent. By this, I want to say that even if we return to the face-to-face classrooms, the world has already changed. The way in which the words mots circulate, our conception of right, for instance, academic freedom, the limits that could make something be considered inviolable, and that also determined the nature of what we did, our relations with institutions, all of this has changed. And this, I believe, changes almost unconsciously with no subjects behind, because the pandemic has forced very rapid changes. Again, these changes have been imposed by the contingency before which we adapt, not by a law that is voted in Congress. We had to respond to the urgency rather than to the very long time of law. The time of the juridic time is very slow. So does this give rise to the thesis that the pandemic will only strengthen authoritarianism? Well, let's just recall some of my theses, some of the main arguments I tried to unfold. First, I said that the virus is not a natural thing but must be overcome with a technique. It is already political, already technical. This means that we are not momentarily suspending rights as we await a return to normalcy. The principle of right is being redefined, but without anyone having decided it. On this point, I could agree with Agamben, except that the premise that allows Agamben to think the state of exception is, in my view, what makes possible this new authoritarianism. For the same reason, there is another topic, another of my argument was that there is no pandemic that can be observed like an object. We are the pandemic. To think about the pandemic is to think about ourselves, to think about what reconfigures our situation as subjects. Without a doubt, this world presents us with very difficult challenges because it already changed our relationship with the rights. Language has already changed, language taken as a structure and not merely as an apparatus of meaning. Language as something that constitutes us and that gives us access to the world, to others, to ourselves. Even language considered as the material of our nocturnal and perhaps diurnal dreams has changed because it circulates in another way. The hardest part of the situation is that if the world has already mutated, we are objects and not subjects of a mutation. So how can we think if we have already been transformed? But if what is accentuated is a disappearance of us as subjects in favor of a hyper-controlled virtual reality and a control that is not voluntarily desired, it seems to me that something occurs that allows us to think. Virtual platforms are mediums, but they are also symbols. They are symbols of a society that has mutated. If we think of Zoom, Zoom allows us to communicate, but Zoom is also the symbol of our fragility, of our necessity to reconfigure a society. On the screen, we see others, but in a certain way, we see the human condition, its fragility. We see ourselves in our codependency on technology, which is not just an instrument, it is part of what constitutes us as humans. It is the reflection of our finitude and of our desire to communicate. In this sense, the mutations to which the pandemic gives rise offer new ways to reflect on ourselves, to think ourselves. It is no longer only language, the unconscious social structures, classes, to think of Marx, that constitutes us, but also technology. And now we are in front of it as if we were witnessing the genesis of humanity or of a pandemic humanity, so to speak. In fact, we are constantly in front of our image before our recorded voices. We can be in a meeting and look at ourselves, which, by the way, does not free us from narcissism, but neither does it confine us to it, contrary to what Han suggests, because precisely what we face is not so much our image, is our fragility. It's the constitutive dimension of technology. So if it is true that we are before our image all the time, what strikes me is that we are before technology that makes possible for an image to be constituted, before our words in their recorded form, and thus we are also before the memory in the process of its formation. For example, right now, I actually see the red light. Well, I want to see the screen because otherwise I will lose the concentration. But if I looked at the screen, I would see the red light that confirms that this conference is being recorded. There are no longer events and the narration that constitute records. We are being recorded and somehow already narrated. There is an immediacy of that we are facing. And this is new, I think. The peculiarity of technology that reveals us as fragile and in which even the ways of making history mutate may be what will allow us to reflect and not be completely immanent prisoners of new authoritarianisms. But then, contrary to what I said before, we are not just pandemic. We are in a pandemic. The pandemic said something about our being in the world, about our being with others, about our possibility to relate to ourselves. We are not merely nullified by the pandemic, the lockdown, technology. The pandemic constitutes a world and therefore a way of being in the world. Perhaps a critical possibility can be found there, the one that, a critical possibility, I mean, the one that characterizes philosophy and that constitutes our freedom. If freedom is not just the freedom to choose, but above all the possibility to think. Before finishing, I would like to return to the title of his talk, The Hour of Fragility. We are in a moment of mutation, and it seems to me that what we are experiencing, and maybe this is an opportunity, a kairos, is that every hour is fragile. Every hour requires a decision. Every hour requires us in a twofold way. Right now, I am at work, and I am with my children who require care, attention, because otherwise they would be in danger. And in this double convening happens, and this double convening happens to all of us in different ways, because there is no longer a workplace separated from home. So we are always called in a twofold manner, at least a twofold manner. The relationship between the private and the public has mutated. Right now you see my private home, and I see your private home. On a more macro level, we are now in front of a screen in a virtual classroom or webinar. I just learned the word, but we are constituting the real world, because the world is constituted with language and its way of circulating. We are always doing two things at once, cultivating very different and very new levels of reality. We are at a distance and together, and in this distance and togetherness, there are new forms of invisibility, new forms in which reality takes shapes and is constituted. At a political level, we are confined, enclosed, but well, some of us are confined, but we are also in an unprecedented form of caring that relates us to more than just ourselves. We have been, in Chile, we have been in a lockdown last year for 6 months, but with this lockdown was a way to protect others. So this loneliness was also a relation to others. On an international political level, decisive things are also occurring. The vaccine, which requires financing systems, contracts for acquisition, is defining new power relations between the states. The vaccine is necessary not only for people, but also for the fluidity of the market. If people do not circulate, financial assets plunge. But the vaccines are a risk, and in a certain way, we are a laboratory. In some countries, a vaccine is approved, while in other countries, it is not. And while buying a vaccine requires a form of negotiation, a contract with another country, not all countries buy it for the same price. Negotiations also shape reality. They involve many things. I know that China made a very good price to Chile, but I have no idea what is behind this negotiation. Thus, the distribution of a vaccine, its commercialization, will have a huge political impact, but perhaps again will involve mutations of what we understand as globalization. Today, not only health depends on the political, but it is defining the political. It is dictating its language, its secret language, its silent language. To come back to my original topic, violence and silence. So the time of fragility is this unfolding that urgently calls on us to rethink ourselves completely without secure foundations, because now there are not only no founding principles, but we depend entirely on technology, on electrical cables, on Wi-Fi networks. It's a time that generates many fears of different kind, affects, passions, and that without a doubt, will require that we continue interrogating, developing critical instruments. this which is our work, for both of us who work in philosophy, an invisible discipline, but one that constitutes a unique opportunity to think reality in its new dimension. This is over.
Thank you so much, Aïcha. Thank you so much. I'm awaiting Nemanja, who will be helping with questions and answers. I see that thus far we have just a few. Nemanja, you want to come forward at this point, or?
Chris, we only have 2 questions in the QA box.
Okay. It just jumped, I think. Aïcha, is it easy for you to read these and answer?
Yeah, thank you very much. The first question is, can you let us know this book? Which book? I don't know. Oh, Superfuhan, maybe. I don't know how I can answer the question.
You could type it in the answer, actually.
Ah, okay. Okay, so Superfuhan is a book that has been published in Spanish very quickly last year at the beginning of a lockdown, and that gathers many articles written by Judith Butler, Giorgio Agamben, many different philosophers. And it was the starting point of a discussion around pandemia. What was incredible is that 2 weeks or even 1 week after the lockdown, there were already so many theories circulating. The second question is, can you speak to the ethical dimension of preferring human life over viral life? Of course, humans will try to protect one another for political reasons, but I wonder if there is an anti-humanist stance that would force us to release our idea of superiority or dominance from our humanness. I think that, well, I think 2 things about this. It's not perfect thought, it's just ideas. First, I think that the virus, we are the virus. I mean, the virus have always constituted us, the virus, because the virus makes possible our immune system, the virus makes possible our relation to other. But this, of course, requires time, it requires means, it is not it is something that calls for an action. So when, for instance, when at the beginning of when the coronavirus was spreading in the world, and the people who were at the head of the state, the presidents, were saying, this is an enemy, we have to fight it. Well, I think the virus is not an enemy, because what we can experience is not the virus by itself, but us as we are changing, us as the virus calls us to change. We can only know us, not the virus by itself. But the virus, of course, constitutes us in our social dimension. So this is the first point. And about the anti-humanist stance, I am more Levinasian than Foucauldian on this point, for 2 reasons. One, because to be anti-humanist always depends on a humanist position at the end. We pretend that we can overcome humanism. And this creates me a theoretical problem. However, this doesn't mean that I want to focus on humanism, but I think that what is very important is to save not the human being, but a human world, which is very different. Human being, the problem of a human being, or the problem of many humanism, is that it it relies on essentialism. But human world is always fragile. And when we lose the world, we lose everything. We lose the possibility to struggle. We lose the possibility to witness for others. We lose the possibility to hear a pain. Losing the human world is what happens in concentration camps. It is the end. So I wouldn't be anti-humanist, but I wouldn't be humanist either. I would just say that we have to fight for this minimum of humanity, that the notion of the world in its phenomenological sense entails, and which doesn't mean that the human is at its center. Hello and thank you. Chile has an institution called motels, which are hotels for couples. One can go to these places for 3 hours. In Chile, one of these motels was closed because it was not considered essential goods. But in Chile, it seems no one complained aside from the owner who claimed sex was an essential good. It is interesting to see who considers what is essential and what every particular society considers essential. It seems that essential is just what it means for survival, confirming the political values of Chilean or a mere animal body. But how will we define the human animal? I think you are making this question necessary, but I wonder if it is also a personal question we all need to consider and are being forced to do so. Thank you for the question. Look, in Chile, yeah, there is this politics defined around essential goods. Chile is a country where the lockdown has been eternal. Last year, it lasted 6 months. It's a really long time. And now we are again in another lockdown. So the first thing that strikes me is effectively that it's completely arbitrary to define what is essential and what is not essential. As you say, is a motel essential or not essential? Is a sex toy essential or not essential? But I mean, on another level, research has been considered essential goods. So universities are open, but all the work that it entailed by taking care of children is not defined as essential good. In Spanish, it's labores de cuidado. I don't know how you call it in English. Children caring. I know there has been many discussions of it in the United States. So it's an essential good to go to the library, and this is a good thing, but it's not an essential good to take care of a children. So if it's not an essential good to take care of a children, what is an essential good? You know, if taking care of children were defined essential goods, I could have had help at home with my children, and I could have worked, and I could have been in very complete situation. So this has obviously political consequences. What you define essential, the people who you see in the street who are driving their cars, of course, are men. And most of the women are at home taking care of the children. So this is on the political level. But I think that my point was to say, in reality, they are not essential goods. They are political goods. They are the goods. The goods are goods in the measure in which they open a world to us. They are not good by themselves. They are good because they open possibilities. And this is much more interesting because this essentializes the problem, and it defines another political context. I hope my answers are clear, because it's very difficult to speak in English, not knowing moreover what my children are doing in the kitchen. Hi, Aïcha, excellent talk, thank you. I agree with you that Agamben's argument tries to preserve a certain mode of natural life, and in a way, just postpones what is inevitable. whereas the pandemic confronts us with changes to our shared norms, definitions. Do you think these new norms and definitions can just be arrived at by trial and error? Or do you see a necessity for changes in the framework we use to think of these norms? Thank you for the question. Well, yeah, this is a very interesting question. There is a necessity in the sense of there is a fatality. I mean, these are changes that in any case, the development of technology was bringing about. We were in any case going toward telecommuting. We were in any case going toward this virtual system of working and of relating, which transforms completely the society, the relation to one another. But it's not the same if the changes are slow or if the changes happens in a state of emergency. In a state of emergency, we accept anything. We accept to suspend our right. If the changes are slow, we can still have the time to discuss. Do we agree to record all our classes? Do we agree to have parents always interfere in the classes of their children? I just had a really very violent fight with other parents who are now giving their opinion on the teachers, saying what they should teach, so now everybody's a judge now, everybody knows what teaching is, These are like these client attitudes. And this is very violent, moreover. I mean, how this context of being working in a complete transparent system, there is no more privacy. This is really a huge change. So I think, yes, I think those changes are necessary in the sense that they would have happened in any case, but we as humans are not discussing them. And this is, again, this relates to the question on post-humanism. I think we have to move from the debate of either humanism or post-humanism. We have to be able to have a hermeneutical relationship to what is happening. Otherwise, there is no more freedom. Can you not say that this was a unifying event? It brings us together with one enemy. So on the one hand, we have a resurrection of a public common at the most basic level, public health. On the other hand, we have the arrival of a surveillance state with a vengeance. Well, I think the enemy is always ourselves. I think in general, I think that evil, le mal, evil, is within ourselves. It is never exterior. We have to, if there is something that I don't trust, it's myself in general. Well, it's exaggerated, but this is something that I think strongly. So, so the enemy is not so much in the virus than in the way we will cope with it. In this sense, I agree with Agamben. But I think that Agamben's position is too easy, definitely. And about the public health, this was something that at the beginning we were imagining that we would change our healthcare system, including in Chile. This is something that, this is the only positive thing that I've observed here, is that the vaccine is free and it is for everybody. It is the only free measure I have seen in Chile in 12 years. Nothing is free in Chile, absolutely nothing. But the vaccine is the first free measure that has been taken. But But as I said before, behind this vaccine, there are negotiations with China that I ignore. So I don't really trust what is happening. And moreover, it's going to be really a big political problem. Which vaccines will be part of a passport, of a sanitary passport? The one I just inoculated is not part of a sanitary passport in Europe. So will I be able to go back to Europe where I have my family? And what about the countries that cannot afford buying the vaccine? So there are not going to be public health policies, I think. I think, I don't know. There are many questions.
Yes, Aïcha, I don't want to exhaust you with these. I know it's very challenging to have to read questions and answer them. Why don't you choose what you would like? And I want to be sensitive to your strength. By the way, I think your English is going marvelously in this medium. It's very impressive, I have to say. But so please don't worry about that.
Thank you, Chris, but I don't believe you. I can see I'm stammering, and I think of Melville. I will read all the questions because I am not able to select them. Thank you, Professor Messina. Your lecture makes me think about the contemporary digital economy of presence in terms of être exposé, which with such a radical disarticulation of community, in what meaningful sense can we speak of mid-sign and mid-design in the current political climate? Well, I think that what is interesting with a lockdown is that to be confined doesn't mean to be recluded. We are exposed and we are in relation with others. Of course, there are many things that we don't see. There are many people to whom that we cannot approach, we cannot touch. I have not been back in Europe for 2 years. It's really a long time. But from the moment in which the lockdown started, people never stopped trying to communicate, like looking for a little hole in order to escape, writing a message, writing a ha ha ha, or sending a face of an emotion, whatever. And this is very important because this means that we are immediately symbolizing what is happening to us. And if we are immediately symbolizing, even if the symbol is imperfect, we are relating to others. We are giving signals. We are in a hermeneutical context. This is very important. Even the mask, it's not only a way of not approaching another, it's a signal. It's a symbol of fragility. So you read the signal, and there is always freedom in the way you read the signs. So I think this is what is really interesting, is that there is a law that is really falling down on us. The mask, the necessity to wash your hands all the time, you cannot approach the other, but we are constantly reading signs. Can I be closer or not? Will I take off my mask or not? So at the same time, this is very interesting. We are relating to the law, and we are transgressing the law all the time because the body cannot stand this mask all the time, and we cannot be exactly at 1 meter of distance. So we are always rewriting the law. This is very interesting. So in this sense, I'm not completely pessimist. Hi, Aïcha, thank you for your talk. Can you say more about the idea that the possibility to experience the social world is crucial for our hunger as desire? I think this is a very important thought to reflect further about the hunger, desire of people who is limited of this experience because of illness or disability, for instance, beyond the pandemic. 2 years ago, I read a book of a neurologist that I didn't know. Usually I don't read this kind of books, of Boris Cyrulnik, It's called La nuit j'écrirai des soleils. I will write suns at night. And this book speaks about children who have been abandoned and whom, because of the lack of affection, were in danger of dying, because since since their sensibility was not activated, their brain was suffocating. I don't know exactly how to say it in English, but because they lacked attention, their sensibility stopped developing and their brain was not any longer connecting. So these are the case of children who die because they don't receive, not because they don't receive food or nutrition, but because they don't receive affection. And this is the case of many kids who have been abandoned. But in this book, Boris Cyrulnik describes the cases of resilience of children who have survived because of imagination. And what happens with imagination? Imagination is also part of sensibility. So imagination also irrigated the brain. And thanks to imagination, resilience activated. So resilience is not a way of overcoming pain or overcoming a danger. It's a window that opens within pain and danger. And this is really extraordinary because it means that we don't only depend of food and water, we depend of stories, of images, of colors. And this is not something, a luxury. This is vital. This is really interesting. It's a really beautiful book and it's very easy to read. And I think that the fact that during the lockdown last year, I really wasn't hungry. It's true that I was really working a lot, but I think that hunger depends of all this connection. Because your whole system is not just eating, it is also feeling. And if you don't have images, if you don't have words, if you don't have others, you stop feeling. And hence you stop feeling hunger. Well, another extraordinary book for this is Kafka's Metamorphoses. The sun wakes up in the body of an insect and the family gives it miet. How do you say miet in English?
Crumbs.
Yeah, but he doesn't want to eat that. And he doesn't want insect food. He starts feeling hungry when he hears the music of his sister. And if you remember, his sister plays very badly the violin according to human standards. But according to her brother's standards, her brother, who is neither human nor animal, she plays beautifully music. And her music feeds his hunger. It's really beautiful. Kafka Metamorphoses is really my favorite book. Is the virus an intruder for non-infected humans? And when it's in the body, it becomes part of the body. Well, I'm not an immunologist, and at school I was really bad at history and at biology. But what I understand from viruses is that, well, there are always viruses. But what I understand is that the virus threaten us, but they are also our condition of possibility to live, because it's also thanks to the virus that we develop an immunitary system. So they are twofold. But of course, the problem is political. The problem is, how do we become immune in a massive context where there are many inequalities? Thank you so much for your provocative and necessary talk. You mentioned in relation to the pandemic that our interior has become our exterior, but today is tomorrow, that our loneliness is in relation to others, and that these are the contours of our current situation. characterized both by control and possibility. I am wondering to what extent today is actually yesterday. In other words, hasn't the pandemic allowed what was already there to emerge? Haven't we realized the social media fantasy of alienation through connection? Well, yes, in a way, it's not completely new. The unfolding of technology, telecommuting, this is something that was already happening, but we were not imagining this, at least I was not imagining this at all. I was not imagining that I will never see my students any longer. This year we started the year only virtual, so all the new students have never been in a physical contact with us. My children haven't been at school for a whole year, and they are very little, so this means that their emotion possibilities are very limited. I had not imagined this at all, and imagination is a very important tool to understand reality, for the reason that I said before, for what Boris Cyrulnik says, but also for Kantian reasons, right? I mean, we need imagination to make a synthesis. So yeah, I mean, I think we will not come back to the when the people who govern say that we will come back to normality. I don't believe this, because everything has changed. The subjectivities have changed. But you are right, this was already en germe, germinating, and it has just spread. I think I read. There is another question.
Is there another question that has come in? Okay.
Oh, can you kindly repeat the name of a book about resilience? It's Boris Cyrulnik. In French, it's La nuit, j'écrirai des soleils. And in English, it would be I will write sun at night, something like this. It's very famous. It's a bestseller. It's not the critical of purism. Well, it's also a kind of bestseller.
Wonderful, Aïcha. Thank you. I'm very aware of the technical means. Just now, it would be nice to. This is such a. It's a talk that has really, I think, brought forth a need in me and the hunger for a longer conversation to explore experiences and their meaning. And I really enjoy the way you've done that today. And it's a very rich approach. Very ethical in a profound sense, in your Levinasian sense, and I really do enjoy that. And then many thoughts come to me, but I will leave these, and we will explore them at another time. And I just want to thank you sincerely. Thank everyone for joining us. But Aïcha, wonderful to be with you. It's this technical platform has allowed us to come together in a way that would simply not have been possible in this moment, and I'm grateful for that too. So take good care of yourself and those children, and let us continue this conversation, all of us. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Christopher. Thank to all of the questions, and I'm just seeing that there are many words in the chat, so thank you a lot. I would have liked to see your faces, and I hope that we will meet physically, because I'm old style. I want physical meeting.
We're working on it. Very good. Thank you, Aïcha. Take good care of yourself, man.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.